A weak state is not a weakness, it is a tragedy. History shows that all dictatorships, all authoritarian forms of government are transient. Only democratic systems are not transient. This is the quote of the man who is the leader of the nation that can challenge the stability of the world, and this is his life story.
Chapter 1. A Child of Leningrad. Vladimir Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in the city of Leningrad, a place still scarred by one of the most brutal sieges in human history. The Second World War had ended only 7 years earlier, but its shadow remained everywhere, in broken buildings, in silent courtyards, and in the memories of those who survived. Putin's parents were ordinary people who had endured extraordinary suffering. His father was badly wounded while fighting in the war. His mother survived the siege of Leningrad, where hunger claimed over 1 million lives. The city had learned to survive through silence, endurance, and sacrifice, lessons that would shape its youngest generation. Putin's family lived in a cramped communal apartment shared with several other families. There was little privacy, little comfort, and little hope of escape. Rats filled the stairwells. Street fights were common. Strength, not kindness, often decided who survived. As a boy, Vladimir was small and often bullied, but he learned quickly that fear invited weakness. He began studying judo, not just as a sport, but as a philosophy, one that taught balance, patience, and using an opponent's force against them. These lessons would stay with him for life. Leningrad's streets were unforgiving teachers. Putin later described how fights were unavoidable, how backing down meant losing respect forever. From an early age, he learned that power had to be defended and authority had to be enforced. At the same time, the Soviet state offered young boys a sense of purpose. Films, books, and school lessons praised discipline, loyalty, and service to the nation. For Putin, the intelligence officers of the KGB were heroes, calm, unseen, and powerful. They represented order in a world that felt chaotic. This was not the childhood of comfort or idealism. It was a childhood shaped by loss, survival, and control. In the ruins of post-war Leningrad, a boy was learning lessons that would later influence a nation and eventually the world.
Chapter 2. The Making of a Believer. As Vladimir Putin moved from childhood into adolescence, the harsh lessons of Leningrad did not fade. They deepened. The city still demanded discipline, and survival still favored those who learned to control their emotions. For Putin, these years became a period of transformation, where instinct began to turn into ideology. He continued his training in judo, dedicating himself with unusual focus. The sport shaped not only his body, but his mind. Judo taught him to respect hierarchy, to obey rules without hesitation, and to accept that victory often came through patience rather than brute force. Every match reinforced a simple idea. Power belonged to those who stayed calm while others lost control. Outside the gym, the Soviet state surrounded young people with a clear narrative about the world. The Cold War defined daily life. The West was presented as both rival and threat, while loyalty to the motherland was described as a moral duty. These ideas were not debated, they were absorbed. Putin was not a rebellious student. He was quiet, observant, and increasingly serious. Teachers noticed his determination and his ability to follow structure. While many of his classmates dreamed of personal comfort or artistic freedom, Putin was drawn towards service. He admired discipline, order, and institutions that promised stability. Books and films about Soviet intelligence officers captured his imagination. The KGB was portrayed not as a force of fear, but as the ultimate guardian of the state, invisible, intelligent, and decisive. To Putin, these men represented control in a dangerous world. Their power was not loud, it was precise. This fascination soon became ambition. While still in school, Putin began asking questions about how to join the intelligence services. He understood that entry required education, obedience, and patience. There were no shortcuts. Advancement came only to those willing to submit fully to the system. University life in Leningrad further reinforced these beliefs. Studying law, Putin learned how power was written into rules and how authority was protected through institutions rather than emotion. Law, in his view, was not about freedom, it was about order. During these years, his loyalty to the Soviet system hardened. He did not see it as perfect, but he saw it as necessary. To him, chaos was the enemy of dignity. Stability, even if harsh, was preferable to weakness. By the time Vladimir Putin graduated, his path was already set. He was no longer just a boy shaped by the streets. He was a believer, in discipline, in hierarchy, and in the idea that the state must always come first. The foundations of his worldview were now firmly in place, waiting for a system that would test them and eventually give him power. Chapter 3: Inside the KGB. For Vladimir Putin, joining the KGB was not an act of adventure or ambition alone. It was a commitment to a system he believed in, a system that promised order in a world he had learned to see as dangerous and unpredictable. By the mid-1970s, when he entered the organization, the KGB stood at the very center of Soviet power. The KGB was not simply an intelligence agency, it was the shield and sword of the Soviet state. Its officers were trained to think in terms of threats, loyalty, and control. Every movement was recorded, every word mattered, trust was limited, and secrecy was absolute. Training was intense and unyielding. Officers were taught to suppress emotion, conceal intention, and follow orders without hesitation. Personal morality had no place in intelligence work. The state defined truth, and the officer's duty was to serve it faithfully. For Putin, this discipline felt natural. Structure brought clarity, and obedience brought strength. Contrary to popular imagination, life inside the KGB was rarely dramatic. It involved long periods of observation, writing reports, and waiting. Officers learned that patience was power. Influence came not through violence, but through information, knowing who was loyal, who was weak, and who could be controlled. In the early 1980s, Putin was posted to East Germany, stationed in the city of Dresden. It was there that he observed the Soviet system from outside its borders. East Germany was tightly controlled, but cracks were beginning to form. Discontent was spreading quietly among the population, and the authority of the state was no longer unquestioned. As protests intensified and the Berlin Wall began to crumble, the illusion of permanence vanished. Crowds gathered. Fear spread through the institutions that once commanded obedience. During one tense moment, Putin reportedly faced an angry crowd outside the KGB office. He contacted Moscow, seeking instructions. None came. The silence from the center of power was devastating. To Putin, this was not merely a political failure. It was a collapse of responsibility. The state that demanded absolute loyalty had failed to protect its own agents. Authority, once unquestioned, had evaporated overnight. Soon after, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The empire that had shaped Putin's identity disappeared without a fight. Russia entered a period of chaos, humiliation, and uncertainty. Institutions dissolved. Ideology faded. Former enemies became advisors. For many, it was liberation. For Putin, it was a warning. The lesson he drew from this moment was permanent. A weak state invites collapse. Power must be firm, visible, and decisive. Hesitation leads to humiliation. Control, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. When Putin returned to Russia, he carried these lessons with him. Though the KGB would soon be dismantled and rebranded, its mindset remained alive within him. He had learned how authority functions behind the scenes, quietly, patiently, and without sentiment. Inside the KGB, Vladimir Putin did not simply serve the state. He absorbed a worldview, one that would later shape his leadership, his policies, and his belief that stability must always come before freedom.
Chapter 4. The Fall of an Empire. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not arrive as a single moment. It unfolded slowly, painfully, and then all at once. For Vladimir Putin, it was not a victory of freedom, but a deep personal and national trauma. By the late 1980s, the foundations of the Soviet state were already weakening. Economic stagnation, political fatigue, and growing public dissatisfaction eroded the authority of the Communist Party. Reforms promised renewal, but instead exposed long-hidden fractures. What had once seemed permanent now appeared fragile. When the Soviet Union finally dissolved in 1991, it did so without a final battle. The red flag was lowered, the borders shifted. 15 new nations emerged from the ruins of a once mighty empire. For millions, including Putin, it felt less like progress and more like loss. Overnight, Russia went from being one of the world's 2 superpowers to a nation struggling to survive. Its economy collapsed, savings disappeared, inflation destroyed wages, factories shut down. Ordinary people found themselves poor in a country that had promised security. State institutions, the military, intelligence services, and bureaucracy were weakened or dismantled. Officers who had devoted their lives to the state were dismissed, unpaid, and forgotten. Loyalty was no longer rewarded. Discipline gave way to confusion. Putin later described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, not because he denied its flaws, but because its fall left a vacuum, one filled with chaos, corruption, and humiliation. In the 1990s, Russia became a country searching for identity. Western advisors arrived with promises of democracy and free markets, but instead of stability, many Russians experienced lawlessness. Crime surged. Oligarchs accumulated immense wealth while the majority struggled to survive. For Putin, these years reinforced his deepest beliefs. He watched as power slipped away from the state and into the hands of private interests. Authority weakened. Respect disappeared. Russia, once feared, now begged for assistance. National pride suffered. NATO expanded eastward. Former Soviet allies drifted away. The world no longer treated Russia as an equal. For those who remembered strength and order, the contrast was unbearable. Yet within this collapse lay opportunity. The old rules were gone, and new power structures were forming. Those who understood how systems worked and how they failed could rise again. Putin did not protest. He did not retreat into nostalgia. Instead, he adapted. He studied the chaos carefully, learning what happens when authority collapses and discipline is abandoned. The fall of the Soviet Empire was not the end of Putin's journey. It was the beginning of his mission. From the ruins of a broken state, a new vision of power was slowly taking shape, one built on control, stability,
and the determination to never allow such a collapse again.
Chapter 5. Chaos of the 1990s. The 1990s were a decade of shock for Russia. The Soviet Union was gone, but nothing solid had replaced it. What followed was not an orderly transition, but a sudden collapse into uncertainty. For millions of Russians, daily life became a struggle for survival. The economy unraveled almost overnight. State industries were dismantled, prices were freed, and inflation erased lifetime savings within months. Pensioners lined up for bread. Workers went unpaid for weeks, sometimes years. The promise of prosperity felt distant and hollow. Crime flourished in the absence of strong institutions. Organized gangs controlled streets, factories, and even local governments. Contract killings became routine. Violence was no longer hidden, it was visible, public, and normalized. The state appeared powerless. Out of this chaos emerged a small group of men who would later be known as oligarchs. Through rushed privatization and political connections, they acquired vast industries for a fraction of their value. Oil, gas, metals, and media fell into private hands. Wealth concentrated at the top, while poverty spread below. Politics mirrored the disorder. Parliament and the presidency clashed openly. In 1993, tanks fired on Russia's own parliament building in Moscow, a shocking image that symbolized how fragile the new system was. Democracy, instead of bringing stability, seemed to deepen division. At the center of this turbulence stood President Boris Yeltsin, charismatic, unpredictable, and increasingly weakened by illness. His government relied heavily on advisors, both domestic and foreign. Decision-making felt improvised, reactive, and unstable. For Vladimir Putin, these years were a lesson in what happens when authority disappears. After returning from Germany, he moved quietly through administrative roles, first in St. Petersburg and later in Moscow. He avoided the spotlight, observing how power was gained, lost, and abused. Putin watched as the state surrendered control to private interests. Laws existed but were rarely enforced. Loyalty meant little. Money spoke louder than institutions. To him, this was not freedom, it was disorder disguised as reform. Russia's global position also weakened. Once feared and respected, now it depended on international loans. NATO expanded closer to its borders. Former allies turned away. National pride eroded alongside economic strength. Many Russians longed not for democracy, but for dignity. Not for freedom, but for stability. The desire for order grew stronger with each year of uncertainty. By the end of the decade, it was clear that the experiment had failed to deliver security. The country was exhausted. It was ready for change, not loud, not revolutionary, but firm. In the midst of this chaos, Vladimir Putin remained largely unnoticed, but he was learning, and soon the disorder of the 1990s would open the door for a new kind of leadership, one shaped by fear of collapse and a determination to restore control. Chapter 6. From Bureaucrat to Power Broker. Vladimir Putin's rise to power did not begin with speeches or public ambition. It began quietly, behind desks and inside offices where decisions were made without attention or applause. While Russia struggled through the chaos of the 1990s, Putin moved steadily through the machinery of the state. After returning from East Germany, he settled in St. Petersburg, working within the city administration under Mayor Anatoly Sobchak. His role was technical, focused on foreign relations and investment. It was here that Putin learned how modern power operated, not through ideology, but through contracts, influence, and loyalty. Putin was not charismatic, but he was efficient. He listened more than he spoke. He avoided public conflict. In a time when many officials sought visibility, Putin preferred invisibility. This made him valuable. He could be trusted to execute orders without drawing attention. As Sobchak's administration weakened, Putin adapted. When his patron lost power, Putin did not fall with him. Instead, he moved to Moscow, entering the federal government. One by one, he passed through roles that expanded his influence while keeping him out of the spotlight. Within the Kremlin, Putin gained a reputation as a problem solver. He was disciplined, reliable, and politically cautious. At a time when instability terrified the ruling elite, these traits stood out. He represented continuity in a system desperate for control. In 1998, Putin was appointed head of the Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB. For him, it was a return to familiar ground. He understood the culture, the mindset, and the importance of loyalty. From this position, his influence expanded rapidly. Soon after, he was elevated again, this time to Prime Minister. To the public, he was still largely unknown, but within the Kremlin, he was becoming indispensable. As President Yeltsin's health declined, the search for a successor intensified. Putin appeared ideal. He was loyal, unthreatening, and disciplined. Few believed he would dominate the system. Yet beneath his quiet exterior was a man shaped by collapse, chaos, and the fear of a weak state. By the end of the decade, Vladimir Putin was no longer just a bureaucrat. He was positioned at the center of power, ready to step forward at the moment Russia needed stability the most.
Chapter 7. Chosen by Yeltsin. By the late 1990s, Russia was exhausted. A decade of economic collapse, political instability, and public humiliation had left the country desperate for continuity. At the center of this uncertainty stood President Boris Yeltsin, weakened by illness, surrounded by rivals, and under immense pressure to secure the future. Yeltsin's presidency had transformed Russia, but it had also fractured it. Power was fragmented. Oligarchs competed for influence. Public trust had evaporated. As Yeltsin's health declined, the question of succession became urgent. The next leader would inherit not only a nation, but its unresolved chaos. In this climate, Vladimir Putin emerged as a solution. He was not a public figure. He made no dramatic promises. He did not threaten existing elites. Instead, he projected discipline, loyalty, and calm.
Chapter 8. The Return of the Strong State. When Vladimir Putin assumed the presidency at the very end of 1999, Russia was fragile. The economy was struggling, public trust in government was at an all-time low, and the scars of the 1990s chaos were still visible in every city and village. Putin faced a country where authority had been weakened, institutions were unreliable, and the world had come to doubt Russia's influence. From the very beginning, he set out to restore what many Russians felt had been lost, a strong, centralized state. His approach was methodical. Unlike the bold promises of the past, Putin focused on rebuilding power quietly, behind the scenes, through control over key institutions, government bureaucracy, and regional administration. One of his first strategies was to bring order to the regions. During the 1990s, governors had gained near-total independence from Moscow, often acting as mini-autocrats. Putin introduced reforms to centralize power, ensuring that regional leaders were accountable to the federal government. Authority would no longer be fragmented. The state, as he saw it, must be singular and decisive. At the same time, he moved to restore public confidence. Crime and corruption had become normalized in the chaotic post-Soviet years. Putin positioned himself as a guarantor of law and stability. Media campaigns emphasized strength, decisiveness, and a return to respect for authority. Even small symbolic acts, public appearances, speeches, and police crackdowns reinforced the idea that Russia was no longer a country in disorder. The economy became a tool of power. Putin strengthened ties with key industries, especially energy and natural resources, ensuring that Moscow controlled wealth and influence. Strategic companies were brought under state influence, and loyalty became as valuable as competence. In this way, the state could both stabilize society and project power externally. Internationally, Putin was cautious but assertive. He sought to rebuild Russia's reputation as a global player while avoiding the mistakes of confrontation that had weakened the Soviet Union in its final years. His message was subtle but clear. Russia would regain respect, but only on its own terms. By the mid-2000s, the impact of these efforts became apparent. Crime rates fell, the economy stabilized, and public approval soared. The sense of chaos that had dominated the 1990s was gradually replaced with order. The Russian state, once fragmented and powerless, was now strong, centralized, and disciplined. Putin's return of the strong state was not simply a political achievement, it was a reflection of the lessons he had carried from Leningrad, the KGB, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Control, discipline, and decisive action had become the foundation of a new Russia, a Russia prepared to assert itself both at home and in the world.
Chapter 9: Chechnya and the Price of Control. In the early years of Vladimir Putin's presidency, one challenge threatened to define his leadership: Chechnya. The republic in the North Caucasus had been racked by war throughout the 1990s, and Russia's authority there was fragile. Guerrilla fighters, lawlessness, and separatist movements challenged Moscow's control, exposing the limits of the state. For Putin, Chechnya was more than a regional conflict. It was a test of the principles he had long held, that a state must be strong, decisive, and unyielding, or risk collapse. The First War had left the Republic devastated, with thousands dead and Moscow humiliated. The lesson was clear: weakness invited chaos. In 1999, after a series of bombings in Russian cities blamed on Chechen militants, Putin responded with military action. The campaign was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. State television portrayed the operation as necessary, a restoration of order in a lawless land. For many Russians, it symbolized the return of authority after the disorder of the 1990s. The Chechen conflict demonstrated both the power and the cost of control. On one hand, Putin's decisiveness restored Moscow's authority in the region. Governors and local officials understood that the Kremlin would no longer tolerate defiance. Law and order were reinforced through force and centralized oversight. On the other hand, the campaign left thousands dead and entire towns in ruins. The message was unmistakable: power had a price. Putin's handling of Chechnya also sent a broader signal to the Russian public, to political rivals, and to the world. It established a pattern that would define his presidency. Strength, loyalty, and discipline were non-negotiable. Hesitation, dissent, or weakness would not be tolerated. The conflict was not only military but symbolic. It reshaped how Russians perceived their country and their leader. Putin's approval ratings soared. The narrative of a strong state capable of protecting its borders, enforcing its authority, and confronting internal threats resonated deeply with a population weary of instability. Yet Chechnya also foreshadowed the complex balance Putin would maintain for the rest of his rule, between the demands of control, the limits of tolerance, and the cost of maintaining power. The lessons learned here would echo in every policy he implemented and every challenge he faced. Authority is fragile, loyalty is essential, and the restoration of order often requires difficult, unyielding decisions.
By the end of the 1990s, Putin had proven that the state could be strong again, but the price of that strength was already clear. Control, once regained, would demand vigilance, sacrifice, and the willingness to act decisively, no matter the consequences.
Chapter 10: Redefining Democracy. As Vladimir Putin consolidated power in the early 2000s, Russia faced a new challenge: how to maintain the appearance of democracy while ensuring the stability of the state. The chaotic freedoms of the 1990s had proven fragile. Political parties were weak, the media often lawless, and elections unpredictable. For Putin, democracy could not be left to chance. It had to be managed. In this period, the Kremlin introduced what came to be known as managed democracy. Elections remained, but the rules of the game were carefully controlled. Opposition voices were allowed, but only to the extent that they posed no real threat to the government. Regional governors were brought under Moscow's influence. Independent media were monitored and pressured, ensuring that criticism never threatened stability. Putin argued, implicitly and explicitly, that Russia could not endure the extremes of unrestrained pluralism. Chaos had followed freedom in the 1990s. Power had slipped into private hands, corruption had flourished, and ordinary citizens had suffered. In his view, democracy needed limits if the state itself was to survive. Critics saw this as authoritarianism. Supporters viewed it as pragmatism. For Putin, it was a lesson learned from history, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disorder of the 1990s, and his years in the KGB. Stability and authority came before personal liberty. Without order, freedom was meaningless. At the same time, Putin cultivated an image of legitimacy. He appeared approachable, decisive, and in touch with ordinary Russians. Elections, public speeches, and media appearances reinforced the perception of choice, while actual power remained tightly controlled. The state projected strength outwardly, while carefully managing dissent within. This strategy extended to the legal system and the oligarchs. Laws were enforced selectively, loyalty was rewarded, and challenges to central authority were neutralized quickly. The message was clear: Russia's democracy would exist on the Kremlin's terms. By redefining democracy in this way, Putin reshaped the relationship between the state and its citizens. Freedom was still a concept, but one bounded by the demands of order. Authority, once fragile, now had structure. Stability, once elusive, now had a guardian. In the eyes of many Russians, this redefinition worked. Crime fell, the economy stabilized, and the state regained respect. Across the nation, the chaotic decade of the 1990s was being replaced by a sense of predictability and control, the hallmark of Putin's leadership. Yet, beneath the surface, a fundamental question remained. Could a democracy survive if it was defined by control rather than choice? For Putin, the answer was clear. The state must endure, even if that meant reshaping the very meaning of freedom.
Chapter 11: The Oligarchs, Friends and Enemies. In the chaotic years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new class of power had emerged in Russia: the oligarchs. These men controlled vast wealth acquired through privatization of state industries, and with it, they held immense influence over politics, media, and public opinion. By the time Vladimir Putin became president, this group had grown strong, perhaps too strong for the fragile Russian state. Putin faced a choice. He could challenge them and risk destabilizing the country, or he could integrate them into a system he controlled. From the beginning, he chose pragmatism. Loyalty would be rewarded,
defiance would be punished. The Kremlin made it clear power came not just from wealth, but from alignment with the state. High-profile conflicts with oligarchs became defining moments of his early presidency. Some were forced into exile, their media empires dismantled or brought under state influence. Others remained, but only under strict oversight, their businesses serving as instruments of Kremlin policy. This approach sent a clear signal: no one, no matter how wealthy, was above the authority of the state. The relationship between Putin and the oligarchs was complex. On one hand, they were essential partners, managing industries, generating revenue, and projecting influence abroad. On the other, they were potential threats, capable of challenging Moscow's authority if left unchecked. Putin's skill lay in balancing these forces, rewarding cooperation while neutralizing opposition. Through this delicate negotiation, the Russian state regained control over its economy. Strategic sectors, oil, gas, and key manufacturing returned to state oversight, either directly or through loyal intermediaries. The oligarchs became part of the machinery rather than rulers outside it. This period demonstrated Putin's strategic patience. He rarely acted impulsively. Instead, he observed, calculated, and moved decisively when the moment was right. Power, he understood, was not a confrontation, but a careful orchestration of loyalty, fear, and opportunity. The lessons of the 1990s were clear. Chaos and fragmentation had allowed wealth to dictate politics. Under Putin, wealth would still exist, but within the boundaries of the state. Authority was restored, and the oligarchs learned that their influence had limits, defined not by money, but by the Kremlin. By the mid-2000s, the system had stabilized. Russia's economy was growing, public support for the president was strong, and the state projected both domestic and international authority. Yet the oligarchs remained a reminder of the delicate balance between power and wealth, a balance that Putin had mastered better than anyone in the country.
Chapter 12: Energy as a Weapon. By the early 2000s, Russia had regained control over its state and its economy. But Vladimir Putin understood that real power extended beyond borders. In a world increasingly dependent on energy, Russia's vast reserves of oil and natural gas became more than resources. They became tools of influence, leverage, and strategy. During the chaotic 1990s, the energy sector had been fragmented. Foreign companies and private oligarchs dominated production and export, and Russia had little control over the flow of its own wealth. Putin moved quickly to reverse this trend. Strategic companies, particularly Gazprom and Yukos, were brought under state influence or tightly regulated, ensuring that the Kremlin controlled both the resources and the revenue. Energy policy became central to Russia's foreign strategy. Europe, heavily dependent on Russian gas, became sensitive to Moscow's decisions. Pipeline routes, pricing, and supply agreements were no longer purely economic matters. They were instruments of diplomacy, signaling Russia's priorities and asserting its power without the use of force. Domestically, the control of energy strengthened Putin's position. Revenues from oil and gas allowed the government to stabilize the economy, pay salaries, reduce debt, and fund public programs. This success reinforced his image as a leader capable of restoring national pride and stability after the turbulence of the 1990s. Internationally, Russia began to wield energy as a subtle weapon. Countries dependent on Russian supplies had to negotiate carefully, recognizing that Moscow's interests extended beyond commerce. This strategic leverage reshaped Russia's relationships with Europe, its neighbors, and even global powers far beyond its borders. The use of energy as a tool was not overtly aggressive, but it was effective. Pipeline politics, pricing negotiations, and supply disruptions became instruments of influence, allowing Russia to project power without military engagement.
Energy became a symbol of state strength, a reminder that Russia, though weakened in the 1990s, could now shape events on its own terms. For Putin, the lessons were clear. Authority was not only maintained through force or bureaucracy, but through resources, influence, and foresight. Energy was a weapon, but one that required patience, strategy, and timing. In the global arena, this subtle form of power often proved more effective than confrontation. By controlling the flow of oil and gas, Putin did more than strengthen Russia's economy. He ensured that the country could no longer be ignored, underestimated, or treated as weak. Energy had become a means of shaping the world, quietly, powerfully, and decisively.
Chapter 13. Russia and the West. As Vladimir Putin strengthened his grip on Russia, the relationship with the West began to take center stage. For decades, Russia had been part of a bipolar world dominated by the Cold War. By the early 2000s, that world had changed, yet old tensions lingered and new challenges emerged. Putin approached the West with a mix of pragmatism and assertiveness. He sought recognition of Russia's restored authority, yet he was cautious of Western influence over internal affairs. The chaos of the 1990s had taught him a lesson. Dependency breeds weakness, and weakness invites exploitation. Initially, there was hope for cooperation. Russia joined international institutions, engaged with NATO, and participated in the G8. Trade and diplomacy flourished. Western leaders praised Russia's stability, and some saw Putin as a partner for a new era. But cracks soon appeared. NATO's expansion eastward, intervention in former Soviet states, and Western criticism of domestic Russian politics created friction. Putin viewed these actions as encroachment, a challenge to Russia's sovereignty. The West, in his eyes, was often slow to recognize the realities of Russian power and history. At the same time, Putin projected Russia's strength abroad. He modernized the military, secured strategic alliances, and used diplomacy to assert Russia's interests. Conflicts in Chechnya, energy politics, and the assertion of influence in neighboring states demonstrated that Russia was no longer willing to accept the role of a passive observer. Putin's approach was calculated. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, but was prepared to respond decisively when he perceived threats. Sanctions, political pressure, or criticism were met with strategy rather than submission. Russia would engage with the world, but on its own terms. The dynamic with the West also shaped domestic politics. Putin framed Russia's sovereignty as inseparable from its strength. Foreign influence, liberal intervention, and external criticism were portrayed as threats to national security. This narrative reinforced his authority at home and justified the consolidation of power. Chapter 14. The Munich Warning. In 2007, Vladimir Putin stepped onto the global stage in a way that would announce Russia's return as a decisive world power. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference, he delivered a speech that was measured in tone, but powerful in message, a warning not only to the West, but to the international order itself. The world had changed since the fall of the Soviet Union. NATO had expanded eastward. Military interventions had occurred in countries formerly within Russia's sphere of influence, and Western nations had often treated Moscow as a secondary player. For Putin, these actions were not abstract concerns. They were signs that history could repeat itself if Russia did not assert its strength. In Munich, Putin's words were calm, deliberate, and deeply informed by decades of experience in intelligence, governance, and survival. He criticized the unipolar world dominated by a single power, arguing that the use of force without respect for international law threatened global stability. He spoke of the dangers of ignoring Russia's legitimate interests and warned that attempts to weaken or isolate his country would have consequences. The speech resonated far beyond the conference hall.
Western leaders listened carefully, some with unease, others with skepticism. To Russians, the Munich address symbolized a turning point, a leader no longer apologetic for the country's past weaknesses, but assertive in defending its position. Putin had made it clear Russia would no longer be pushed aside. This moment also reflected a broader theme in Putin's leadership. From Leningrad's harsh streets to the halls of the KGB, he had learned the importance of perception, timing, and decisiveness. Authority was reinforced not only through action, but through the careful use of words, statements that signaled strength, resolve, and the willingness to act if necessary. The Munich warning was not merely a critique of Western policy, it was a statement of Russia's worldview. It emphasized sovereignty, national interest, and the enduring principle that a strong state must command respect. Diplomacy, negotiations, and alliances were important, but only when conducted from a position of strength. For Putin, this moment marked a subtle but significant shift. Russia was no longer recovering from collapse or chaos, it was asserting its place on the global stage. The world was reminded that power, once restored, carries both responsibility and influence, and that Russia, under Putin, would ensure its voice was heard. The Munich speech would echo through the years that followed, setting the tone for Russia's interactions with Europe, NATO, and the United States. It was a warning, a declaration, and a promise. The era of a passive Russia was over.
Chapter 15: Crimea and the Breaking Point. In 2014, Vladimir Putin faced a moment that would define his presidency and reshape global politics: the annexation of Crimea. The Ukrainian Revolution had toppled President Yanukovych, and instability spread across the region. For Russia, it was not just a neighboring crisis, it was a strategic and symbolic challenge. Crimea held deep historical and military significance. It was home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet and a region with a large ethnic Russian population. For Putin, allowing Ukraine's shift toward the west without response would signal weakness, a mistake Russia could not afford. The operation was swift and carefully calculated. Unmarked troops, political maneuvers, and local support ensured minimal direct confrontation. Within weeks, Crimea was under Russian control. The international reaction was immediate: sanctions, condemnation, and warnings. But within Russia, Putin's approval surged. The move was framed as the restoration of national pride and protection of Russian-speaking citizens. Crimea demonstrated a key principle of Putin's leadership: decisive action at critical moments. It reflected lessons from his life, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chaos of the 1990s, and the need to project strength. Hesitation, in his view, risked humiliation and loss of influence. The annexation also marked a breaking point in Russia's relations with the West. Sanctions reshaped the economy, diplomacy became tense, and a new era of confrontation began. Yet Putin viewed this not as isolation, but as a reassertion of Russia's sovereignty and a signal that global power must respect national interests. Crimea was more than territory, it was a statement. Russia, under Putin, would defend what it saw as vital, act decisively, and shape events on its own terms. It was a turning point, one that would influence every geopolitical decision in the years to come.
Chapter 16: Syria and Global Reach. By the mid-2010s, Vladimir Putin had established Russia as a strong state at home, but he also sought to expand its influence globally. Syria became the stage where Russia would project power beyond its borders, demonstrating that its return to the world stage was real and decisive. The Syrian civil war had begun in 2011, and as the conflict deepened, the Assad regime faced existential threats from both rebels and extremist groups. For Moscow, Syria was not just an ally, it was a strategic lifeline.
The country provided access to the Mediterranean, a foothold for military presence, and a chance to assert Russia's influence in the Middle East. In 2015, Russia launched a military intervention. Airstrikes, logistical support, and coordination with Syrian forces allowed Moscow to shift the balance of the war. The campaign was precise and highly publicized, demonstrating advanced capabilities while reinforcing the image of Russia as a decisive global player. The operation in Syria also reflected a consistent pattern in Putin's leadership. Action was deliberate, calculated, and strategically timed. Force was used not recklessly, but with purpose. The goal was not only military success, but political leverage, signaling that Russia could influence global conflicts without sacrificing domestic stability. Syria became a symbol of Russia's renewed global reach. It showed that the country, once humiliated and weakened, could now intervene decisively in world affairs. For Putin, it was proof that the lessons of the past, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the chaos of the 1990s, had informed a new approach to power, assertive, calculated, and far-reaching. Through Syria, Putin reinforced a central principle. Russia's authority, when combined with strategy and strength, could command respect on the global stage. It was not just about protecting allies, it was about reminding the world that Moscow's influence could no longer be ignored.
Chapter 17: Information, Influence, and Fear. In the 21st century, power was no longer defined solely by armies or wealth. Vladimir Putin understood this deeply. Influence could be wielded quietly, invisibly, through information, media, and the shaping of narratives. Control over perception became as important as control over territory. From the early 2000s, Putin consolidated the Russian media, bringing television networks and major news outlets under state oversight. Critical voices were marginalized or silenced, while messages of stability, national pride, and leadership were amplified. By shaping the flow of information, the Kremlin could control what Russians saw, heard, and believed. But the strategy extended far beyond Russia's borders. In Europe, the United States, and other regions, Russian influence began to operate subtly through disinformation campaigns, political interference, and cyber operations. The goal was not always to conquer, but to disrupt, weaken, and create leverage. Confusion and doubt became tools of power. This approach reflected a consistent principle in Putin's worldview. Weakness invites exploitation, and perception can be as decisive as force. A state that controlled the narrative could strengthen loyalty at home and complicate the calculations of rivals abroad. Fear, carefully measured, was another instrument. By demonstrating decisive action in Crimea, Chechnya, and Syria, Putin reinforced the idea that the Russian state was uncompromising. Allies, opponents, and observers learned that challenges to Moscow would not be ignored. Authority, he showed, carries consequences. The combination of media, narrative, and calculated intimidation created a system in which Russia could project influence efficiently. It was subtle, often invisible, but highly effective. Diplomacy, elections, and public opinion all became part of a broader strategy to protect and expand Russia's interests.
Chapter 18: Ukraine and the World in Shock. In 2022, the world watched in disbelief as Vladimir Putin made a decision that would shock the international order: the invasion of Ukraine. Unlike previous interventions, this was not a calculated regional move or a limited display of power. It was a full-scale military campaign that reverberated across the globe.
For Russia, Ukraine was not just a neighbor, it was a country intertwined with history, culture, and identity. Putin viewed the westward shift of Ukraine as a direct challenge to Russian influence and a threat to the vision of a sphere of security surrounding the nation. The stakes were existential, at least from his perspective. The invasion sent immediate shockwaves. Cities were targeted, populations displaced, and the world condemned the action. Sanctions were imposed at unprecedented levels, alliances hardened, and global economies trembled. Yet within Russia, the narrative was controlled, framed as a defense of Russian speakers, a response to NATO encroachment, and a necessary act to protect national security. Ukraine also demonstrated the limits of traditional power. Despite Russia's military might, resistance was fierce, and international support for Ukraine was swift. The conflict revealed that modern power was no longer only about territory or resources, it was also about perception, alliances, and resilience. For Putin, the invasion reflected the same principles that had guided his life: decisive action, projection of strength, and the willingness to take risks to protect perceived national interests. It also highlighted the costs of ambition: global isolation, economic strain, and the risk of protracted conflict.
Chapter 19: Power Without an End. As Vladimir Putin's presidency extended into its third decade, the question of limits, or the lack thereof, became central. Power, he had learned from Leningrad's harsh streets, the KGB, and the chaos of the 1990s, was both fragile and absolute. To hold it, one must act decisively, consolidate control, and never yield. Power without an end reflects the essence of Putin's leadership, a system where authority is centralized, opposition is contained, and influence stretches across society, the economy, and international relations. Under his guidance, Russia became a state where the boundaries of governance are defined by the Kremlin, not by tradition or law. Domestically, this meant loyalty was rewarded, dissent punished, and institutions shaped to reinforce authority. Governors, oligarchs, media, and security services all operated within a system designed to maintain power at the center. Even elections and democratic structures became tools to legitimize the ongoing consolidation. Internationally, Russia projected power with a combination of diplomacy, military intervention, and strategic influence. Crimea, Syria, and Ukraine all demonstrated that authority could be extended far beyond national borders, challenging the assumptions of rivals and signaling that Russia, under Putin, would act on its own terms. Yet this concentration of power is not without consequence. Decisions are measured not only in immediate effect, but in long-term endurance. Alliances, sanctions, and global perception are all part of the delicate balance that sustains unending authority. Failure to act decisively in Putin's worldview risks chaos, something he witnessed all too clearly in the 1990s. Chapter 20: The World After Putin. Vladimir Putin's story is not only about Russia, but about the world he has helped shape. As his presidency stretches over decades, his influence reaches far beyond borders, redefining geopolitics, power, and the very concept of leadership in the modern era. The world after Putin is one in which traditional assumptions about power are challenged. Nations watch carefully, knowing that Russia, under his rule, is decisive, strategic, and unyielding. Military interventions, energy politics, cyber influence, and calculated diplomacy have shown that authority is not only enforced by force, but by perception, strategy, and patience. Domestically, his legacy is complex. He has restored stability after the turbulence of the 1990s, centralized power, and reinforced national identity. Russia, under his guidance, is stronger, more cohesive, and confident in its place on the global stage. Yet this stability comes at a cost. Freedoms are constrained, opposition is minimized, and dissent is carefully managed. Internationally, Putin has altered the balance of power. Alliances have shifted, old assumptions have been questioned, and the world has learned to respect and sometimes fear the assertiveness of modern Russia. From Crimea to Syria, from energy leverage to information strategy, the influence of one leader has rippled across continents. The long-term consequences remain to be seen. Economies, societies, and international systems must adapt to a world in which authority is centralized, power is persistent, and strategy often outweighs morality in statecraft. Putin's impact is not measured only in policies or borders, but in the precedent he sets for leadership, resilience, and the exercise of power. The world after Putin is a world reminded of history's lessons, that weakness invites exploitation, that authority demands vigilance, and that leadership, when exercised with discipline and calculation, can reshape nations and global order alike.